In the brutal winter of 1942, a terrifying rumor began to circulate among the veteran pilots of the German Luftwaffe stationed over Stalingrad. They were elite flyers, the masters of the Eastern Front, yet they were being warned to avoid a specific Soviet aircraft at all costs. The order was simple: if you see a Yak-1 with a white lily painted on the fuselage, do not engage. The Germans, misidentifying the flower, called her the White Rose of Stalingrad. They knew that the pilot of that plane wasn't just skilled, she was lethal. The pilot was Lydia Litvyak. To the casual observer, she looked like anything but a stone-cold killer. She was 21 years old, petite, with striking blonde hair and a persistent habit of tucking fresh wildflowers into her cockpit instrument panel. She was known to dye her white silk parachute scraps into stylish scarves. But the moment she climbed into the cockpit of her Yak-1 fighter, the Lily became a predator. She didn't just fly, she hunted with a predatory aggression that stunned her male counterparts and terrified her enemies. Lydia had been a flying instructor before the war, amassing hundreds of flight hours before the Soviet Union was even invaded. When the Nazis crossed the border, she didn't wait to be asked. She traveled to a recruitment center, lied about her flight hours to bypass the bureaucratic red tape, and joined the legendary Night Witches, the all-female aviation regiments formed by Marina Raskova. However, Lydia was too aggressive for night bombing. She wanted to look the enemy in the eye. She was soon transferred to an elite, predominantly male fighter regiment, where she had to prove herself in a world that believed women belonged on the ground. She didn't just prove them wrong, she redefined the ace pilot. In the smoke-choked skies over the ruins of Stalingrad, Lydia Litvyak began to tally kills with terrifying speed. She became the first woman in history to shoot down an enemy aircraft in solo combat. She wasn't just a pilot, she was a symbol of Soviet defiance. The White Rose was a ghost in the clouds, a flash of silver and white that left burning Messerschmitts in her wake. The sky, she was proving, had no gender, only those who could survive the turn, and those who couldn't. Lydia Litvyak was a study in extreme contradictions. Standing barely over 5 feet tall, she often had to use cushions just to reach the rudder pedals of her Yak-1 fighter. To her male peers in the 73rd Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, she initially seemed like a mascot, a girl playing at a man's game. But Lydia possessed a psychological steel that made her more aggressive than almost any pilot on the front. She didn't just want to defend the motherland, she wanted to dominate the airspace. Her background was one of intense, self-taught discipline. Growing up in Moscow, she became obsessed with flight at 14, joining a flying club and making her first solo flight at 15. By the time the war broke out, she was a seasoned instructor with a feel for the machine that bordered on the instinctive. However, she carried a hidden burden. Her father had been executed as an enemy of the people during Stalin's Great Purge. In the Soviet Union, this was a mark of shame that usually led to a labor camp. Lydia's climb into the cockpit was, in many ways, a desperate race to prove her loyalty and erase the shadow over her family name through sheer, bloody excellence. Despite the mud, the freezing cold, and the constant smell of oil and death at the frontline airfields, Lydia refused to surrender her femininity. She was famous for picking bunches of wildflowers and tucking them into the cockpit, turning the cramped, metal interior of her war machine into a small, private garden. She would take white silk from parachutes, meant for survival, and meticulously dye it with crushed berries or ink to create fashionable scarves. This wasn't vanity, it was an act of defiance. She was reclaiming her identity in a system that tried to turn everyone into a gray, nameless soldier. Her male wingmen quickly realized that her beauty was a distraction from a terrifying combatant. In the air, Lydia was a shredder. She favored high speed, close-in attacks, often holding her fire until she was so close to the German bombers that the oil from their engines would spray across her windscreen. She became part of a free hunter group, elite pilots allowed to roam the front lines and pick their own targets. In this male-dominated world, she earned the nickname the White Lily of Stalingrad, though the German pilots she sent spiraling into the Volga continued to whisper about the White Rose. She wasn't just a female pilot, she was a lethal virtuoso who demanded respect with every pull of the trigger. The moment that solidified Lydia Litvyak's legend occurred in the late summer of 1942, during a swirling dogfight over the burning ruins of Stalingrad. The sky was a mess of smoke and tracers, and Lydia found herself locked in a lethal dance with a German Messerschmitt Bf 109. This wasn't a standard encounter. The pilot of the German plane was a decorated expert with 20 confirmed kills, a veteran of the Western Front who viewed the Soviet pilots as amateurs. For several minutes, the two aircraft twisted through the clouds in a vertical scissors maneuver, each trying to gain the angle for a killing shot. Lydia won. With a burst of cannon fire, she shredded the German's engine, forcing him to bail out over Soviet-held territory. When the German pilot was captured and brought to the Soviet command post, he demanded to meet the man who had outflown him. He was a proud aristocrat of the air, and he expected to see a hulking, battle-hardened veteran. Instead, the guards opened the door to reveal a 21-year-old girl with blonde hair, wearing a white silk scarf and smelling faintly of the wildflowers she kept in her cockpit. The German laughed. He turned to his captors and told them the joke was in poor taste. He refused to believe that this tiny girl could have possibly survived a dogfight with him, let alone won it. He assumed the Soviets were playing a propaganda trick to humiliate him. Lydia didn't argue. She didn't yell. She simply stood up, walked to a chalkboard, and began to draw the flight paths of their engagement. She described every bank, every roll, and every throttle change they had made. She pointed out the exact moment he had over-rotated his turn and the split-second window where he had lost sight of her in the sun. As she spoke with cold, clinical precision, the German's face went pale. He realized that this girl hadn't just gotten lucky, she had intellectually and physically dismantled his flying style. In a moment of pure, reluctant chivalry, the German ace stood up, clicked his heels, and bowed to her. He recognized that he hadn't been defeated by a girl, but by a superior pilot. This encounter turned Lydia into a celebrity across the Soviet Union. It wasn't just about the kill, it was about the psychological victory. She had shattered the myth of Nazi aerial superiority and proven that the White Rose was the most dangerous thing in the Stalingrad sky. But for Lydia, the fame was a heavy burden. Every kill made her a bigger target, and as the German Air Force began to realize who was behind the lily-painted yak, they started hunting for her with a vengeance. By 1943, the legend of the White Rose had become a double-edged sword. While the Soviet press hailed her as a goddess of the air, the German Luftwaffe had officially mocked her for death. They had grown tired of the humiliation. A dedicated group of German aces was reportedly tasked with one specific objective: find the yak with a lily on the nose and bring it down. Lydia was no longer just a pilot. She was a trophy. The pressure began to take a devastating physical and emotional toll. Lydia was wounded multiple times in rapid succession. In one engagement, she was hit in the leg and shoulder, yet she refused to stay in the hospital, crawling back to her airfield to fly with her limbs still bandaged. Her aircraft was a patchwork of bullet holes and replaced panels. But the deepest wound was the loss of Alexei Solomatin, her wingman and the man she loved. She watched from the ground as his plane stalled and plummeted during a training exercise, exploding on impact. In the brutal logic of the Eastern Front, there was no time for grief. Lydia channeled her heartbreak into a cold, mechanical fury. She stopped picking flowers. The lily became a jagged thorn. On August 1, 1943, the sky over the Donbass region was a furnace. Lydia was on her fourth sortie of the day, an exhausting pace that would break most men. She was escorting a group of IL-2 Sturmovix when a swarm of Messerschmitts dived out of the sun. The German pilots didn't engage the bombers. They ignored the mission to swerve toward the lone Yak-1 with the famous white flower. It was an ambush. Lydia fought with her characteristic aggression, twisting her yak through the clouds, but she was outnumbered 8-1. Her fellow pilots watched in horror as she spiraled through a cloud bank, pursued by two German fighters. Tracers lit up the gray mist, and then, silence. Her radio went dead. When the other Soviet planes returned to base, Lydia's spot on the airfield remained empty. There was no wreckage, no parachute, and no body. For the Soviet High Command, this was a disaster. Because her body wasn't found, she couldn't be officially declared dead. She was listed as missing, which carried the dark suspicion of desertion or capture. The woman who had given everything for the motherland was denied her final honors. Her story left hanging in a state of agonizing limbo for decades. For over 3 decades, the name Lydia Litvyak was shrouded in a painful, bureaucratic silence. Because she had vanished without a trace, the Soviet government refused to grant her the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. There were whispers that she had been captured, that she had survived and was living in the West, or that she had defected, accusations that were a profound insult to the woman who had bled for Stalingrad. But while the state was content to let her memory fade, a small group of women, her former mechanics and fellow night witches, refused to let the white rose wither. The search was led by her former mechanic, Inna Pasportnikova, who spent nearly 30 years scouring the Donbass countryside. She interviewed elderly villagers, trekked through overgrown forests, and investigated hundreds of anonymous crash sites. Inna wasn't just looking for a plane, she was looking for her friend's honor. Finally, in 1979, the mystery unraveled. Near the village of Dmitrievka, locals led researchers to a remote field where a small fighter plane had crashed in 1943. The wreckage revealed the remains of a pilot buried by the villagers long ago. Forensic examination confirmed the impossible. It was Lydia. She hadn't defected. She hadn't surrendered. She had fought to the absolute limit of her machine, crash-landing her crippled yak after being overwhelmed by the German ambush. She had died of a massive head wound shortly after the impact, alone in the tall grass of the Ukrainian steppe. The discovery changed everything. The cloud of suspicion vanished. In 1990, Mikhail Gorbachev finally signed the decree posthumously awarding her the Gold Star of a Hero of the Soviet Union. It was a victory 36 years in the making. Lydia Litvyak was no longer missing, she was a legend brought home. Lydia Litvyak's legacy is etched into the very history of aviation. With 12 solo victories, she remains the highest-scoring female fighter ace of all time. But her impact goes beyond the scoreboard. She shattered the industrial age myth that women lacked the killer instinct or the technical aptitude for high-stakes aerial combat. She proved that in the cockpit, G-forces don't care about your gender, and a bullet doesn't care who pulls the trigger. Today, she is a symbol for female pilots across the globe. She represents the total warrior, someone who could embrace her femininity with silk scarves and wildflowers while simultaneously being the most feared hunter in the sky. She taught the world that you don't have to sacrifice who you are to be a hero. The White Rose of Stalingrad didn't just defend her country. She cleared a path for every woman who has ever looked at the clouds and decided to own them.